arbitrary and illegal way, days before I was released from, that is to say, at least I was in prison.
Civil society watched renowned publisher in the country was shuttled back to prison under house arrest. Things were simply struck down basis. Zamora reached one arrest on internationally conditions. Central American journalism than ever. Roman Gressier, the editor of El Friday, May 2nd, May edition of America in Minutes. Despite the lack against him, despite through advocacy for his release, denunciation of torture, and despite the courts was violated, why back behind bars?
In Nicaragua, the house arrest of
more to El Salvador and Guatemala. In the case of Guatemala,
Central on Elf.
When Jose over to Guatemalan authorities prison, he seemed to have to do so, into exile, like a dozen rights, and 2 UN denounced that the judiciary keeping him in prison, then the court's threats and intimidation trial. And the judge had ordered his release on Howler in late October, 100 days in prison. It read last month that Guatemala's top prosecutors has received at least 2 crimes against Judge Garcia, now in appellate court Mariscal Zavala prison. The answer, perhaps, in October 2024, Garcia that he would not flee the trial from his home. He had done so without leaving Guatemala months, made it all the more contradictory.
In an absolutely arbitrary and illegal way, he decided to return to 2 days before I was released from prison. That is to say, if 2 days before my release I was in prison, I had to go back to prison.
In mid-March, Guatemalan civil society watched in horror as the most renowned publisher in the country, Jose Rubén Zamora, was shuttled back to prison after almost 5 months under house arrest. Months of proceedings were simply struck down, and without any apparent legal basis. On Friday, April 25th, Zamora reached 1,000 days since his arrest on internationally condemned money laundering allegations. Zamora, a figurehead of Central American journalism, is now more embattled than ever. I'm Roman Gressier, the editor of El Faro English. It's Friday, May 2nd, and you're listening to the special May edition of our original podcast, Central America in Minutes. This month, we ask, despite the lack of money laundering evidence against him, despite 3 years of international advocacy for his release, despite his own denunciation of torture and humiliation in prison, despite the court's own recognition that due process was violated, why is Jose Rubén Zamora back behind bars?
In Nicaragua, the house arrest of Daniel Ortega's brother
relates more to El Salvador and Honduras than to Guatemala. In the case of Guatemala,
globalism comes to die at CIPA, but in El Salvador, it's already dead.
Central America in Minutes on El Faro English.
When Jose Rubén Zamora turned himself over to Guatemalan authorities on March 10th to return to prison, he seemed to have had every reason not to do so, and to instead flee Guatemala into exile, like a dozen of his colleagues. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and 2 UN special rapporteurs denounced that the judiciary seemed more bent on keeping him in prison than resolving the charges against him. The court had just publicly denounced threats and intimidation, as was the case throughout the trial. And the judge, Eric Garcia, had ordered his release on house arrest just 5 months earlier, in late October, on the grounds that his over 800 days in prison had violated his due process rights. Newspaper La Hora reported last month that, contrary to the denials of Guatemala's top prosecutors, the Attorney General's office has received at least 2 criminal complaints of death threats against Judge Garcia. Now, an appellate court was sending Zamora back to Mariscal Zavala prison. The answer, perhaps, was straightforward. In October 2024, Zamora had promised Judge Garcia that he would not flee the country, that he would await trial from his home. And he had done so without leaving Guatemala City for weeks, months. This, thus, made it all the more contradictory when the court sent him back to prison. The implicit assertion was that he was a flight risk, despite the fact that he had demonstrated the contrary. Meanwhile, the charges against him continued to spiral out of control. What started as money laundering charges almost 3 years ago bifurcated into 2 processes, the second for alleged obstruction of justice while on trial. He had his original June 2023 money laundering conviction and 6-year prison sentence struck down as baseless, and a retrial ordered. But in the process, almost a dozen defense attorneys resigned, and some, like former tax chief Juan Solorzano Folpa, were criminalized. Meanwhile, his newspaper El Periódico, which had already faced years of financial asphyxiation and threats, collapsed in May 2023, 1 month before that conviction. His former staff and family largely left for exile, and prosecutors pursued a dozen journalists and columnists writing about the case. The message was heard loud and clear. The Jose Rubén Zamora case would be scorched earth. In recent weeks, the knot thickened. As we covered in episode 21, the Foundation Against Terrorism, a plaintiff organization, filed a new round of money laundering charges against Zamora in February, alleging that he received $750,000 not to publish about Juan Carlos Monzon, the secretary of imprisoned former Vice President Roxana Baldetti. But Monzon stated that he was not even sure that Zamora had received the alleged money. 33 months after police rappelled down from the roof into Zamora's house, the anti-Zamora hydra continues to grow. 1 second before we get on with today's show, I just want to invite you to join our crowdfunding community. If you appreciate award-winning, uncensored journalism that translates Central America, go to support.elfaro.net and help us continue. Thank you. Even if Jose Rubén Zamora, who is 68 years old, successfully defends himself at retrial in the original case against him, he looks set to face years of legal challenges. To a great extent, it could hinge on the upcoming Attorney General elections, which will be finalized in May 2026. With a year left in Porras' term, threats and attacks against journalism in Guatemala continue unabated and unpunished. The Foundation Against Terrorism is threatening lawfare against independent outlet Prensa Comunitaria, which covers Guatemala and its diverse communities from decidedly Maya perspectives. Milton Polanco, president of the Association of Journalists of Jutiapa, a rural eastern Guatemalan border department pierced by drug trafficking, disappeared in early May. In the case of Zamora, he ran one of the leading newspapers in Guatemala for over 2 decades, running blistering stories on corruption, organized crime, and impunity. His prosecution continues to test President Bernardo Arévalo's real commitment to press freedom. Arévalo has condemned Jose Rubén Zamora's incarceration as political persecution. This is him in October 2024, right before Zamora was released on house arrest.
We are especially concerned by the events mentioned by his family, of illegitimate pressures and acts of torture suffered by Jose Rubén Zamora. No more inadequate use of the justice system. No more torture and terror against those who think differently. No more dark system pursuing the exercise of the press, which should always be free and uncomfortable to power when necessary.
True, under Arévalo, prison conditions for Zamora have improved, according to his son, Jose Carlos, and Guatemalan press freedom advocates. He is now much more free to receive visits and no longer faces aspects of the psychological torture that he did